Welcome to Build to Brand, the show about how brands are actually constructed, not the campaigns, not the taglines, the architecture underneath, the belief systems, the founding decisions, the invisible choices nobody discusses until the whole thing either holds or cracks. I'm your host Tanvi, and today we are starting with another headline. Anthropic's chief is back in talks with the Pentagon about an AI deal. 11 words, and buried inside them is one of the most interesting brand stories in modern tech, about conviction, about differentiation, about what happens when a company built to be different is forced to prove it costs something. Let's go. July 2025, Anthropic signs a $200 million contract with the US Department of Defense. Claude, Anthropic's flagship AI, becomes the first major large language model deployed on classified military networks. Not a research pilot. Operational infrastructure at the highest levels of national security. It should have been a straightforward milestone. It was not. Anthropic negotiated two hard contractual limits into the deal. 1. Claude cannot be used for mass domestic surveillance of American citizens. 2. It could not power fully autonomous weapon systems that select and engage targets without meaningful human involvement. These were written red lines, agreed as conditions of the contract itself. The Pentagon pushed back. They wanted blanket all lawful use rights, the standard government position, deploy the technology across any use case that falls within the law, without case-by-case carve-outs. Anthropic said no. The deal collapsed. What followed was swift and, for an American tech company, remarkable. Defense Secretary Hegseth declared Anthropic a supply chain risk, language ordinarily reserved for compromised foreign vendors and adversarial technology. The Trump administration directed federal agencies to stop using Claude entirely. Within hours, OpenAI filled the gap, offering the unrestricted access Anthropic had refused to provide. The administration praised the deal publicly and effusively. Then an internal memo from Dario Amodei, Anthropic CEO, leaked. He called the OpenAI arrangement safety theater. He described the administration's praise of compliant AI companies as dictator-style praise, the kind of endorsement that should make any safety-serious organization deeply uncomfortable, not proud. And then, shortly after, Dario Amodei went back to the negotiating table. That sequence, the walkout, the memo, the return, is the story. But to understand what it means, you have to understand what Anthropic actually built and why this tension existed in the first place. In 2021, Dario Amodei was VP of Research at OpenAI, one of the people most directly responsible for building the capabilities that made that organization famous. An insider's insider. He understood the technology, the incentive structures, and the risks from the inside out. And then he left, took 11 colleagues with him, including his sister, Daniela. The stated reason, a fundamental disagreement about pace and priorities. The Microsoft investment had shifted OpenAI's center of gravity toward commercialization. Amodei believed the prevailing logic, build capability fast, manage safety later, was not just ethically questionable but technically wrong. So they built Anthropic on a single founding premise, that safety and capability are not in tension, that you can build AI that is both powerful and careful, and that the way to prove it is to be at the frontier, not outside it. This is the classic insider move, not an outsider dreaming up a better version from scratch. Someone who understood the system deeply enough to know exactly where it was failing and build the alternative with that knowledge intact. The disruption is more credible because the disruptor was there. But the insider inheritance cuts both ways. The same understanding that makes the critique sharp also tethers the new company to the world it left. Anthropic has always been in the frontier race. Claude has always been a competitive, cutting-edge model. The brand said, "We are building differently." The strategy said, "We are also building to win." Both things were true simultaneously, and that tension would eventually need to resolve itself. You cannot evaluate Anthropic's brand without looking at Claude closely, because Claude is where the founding argument is either proven or exposed. And the case starts with the hard numbers. Let's run through them. On GPQA Diamond, graduate level scientific reasoning in biology, physics, and chemistry, a benchmark so difficult that human PhD experts score only 65 to 74%, Claude 3.7 Sonnet scores 84.8% in extended thinking mode, outperforming OpenAI's O1 at 78% and DeepSeek R1 at 71.5%. On human eval, the standard coding benchmark, Claude 3.7 Sonnet scores 94%, placing it at the top of publicly available models. On SWA Bench Verified, which tests models against real-world software engineering tasks pulled from actual GitHub repositories, Claude 3.7 Sonnet scores 70.3% with a custom scaffold, the highest published score for any model at the time of release. On Math 500, a set of competition-level mathematics problems, it scores 96.2%, just behind OpenAI's O3 Mini at 97.9%. On IF-eval, which measures how precisely a model follows complex multi-constraint instructions, Claude scores 93.2%. For a non-technical listener, here's what those numbers mean in plain terms. The GPQA score means Claude is answering graduate-level science questions more accurately than the domain experts who wrote them. The SWA Bench score means it can read a real GitHub issue, understand the code base, and submit a working fix autonomously more than 7 times out of 10. The IF-eval score means if you give Claude a set of detailed, layered instructions, it follows them with a precision that other models don't reliably match. Claude also operates with a 200,000 token context window, roughly the equivalent of a 400-page book held in active memory at once. In practical terms, this means you can feed Claude an entire legal contract, a full research corpus, or a large code base and ask questions that require synthesizing the whole thing. GPT-4o's context window is 128,000 tokens. That gap is not cosmetic. It changes what the model can actually do on long-form, high-complexity tasks. Now, what produces these numbers? Because benchmark scores are a result, not an explanation. The explanation is in the training architecture. Most large language models use reinforcement learning from human feedback, RLHF, as their primary alignment technique. The process works like this. Human raters compare 2 responses from the model and select the better one. That preference data trains a reward model, which then guides further fine-tuning. The system learns to produce outputs that score well with human evaluators. It works, but it has architectural limitations. It is expensive to scale, requires humans to review large volumes of outputs, including harmful ones, and it tends to produce models that are good at pleasing evaluators, which is not always the same as being accurate or genuinely useful. Anthropic's approach, constitutional AI or CAI, changes the feedback loop. Instead of relying on human raters at every step, they train the model against a written set of principles, a constitution. In the supervised phase, the model generates responses and then critiques and revises its own outputs against these principles. In the reinforcement learning phase, which Anthropic calls RLAIF, reinforcement learning from AI feedback, a separate model evaluates response pairs based on the constitution, generating the preference data that guides training. Human oversight exists, but it operates at the level of designing and validating the principles, not reviewing every individual response. Anthropic published the original constitutional AI paper in 2022. It was, as researchers now recognize, the first large language documented use of synthetic data in an RLHF training pipeline, a technique that has since become standard across the industry. Anthropic also invests heavily in mechanistic interpretability, research aimed at understanding what is actually happening inside the model, not just what it outputs. In May 2024, they published a landmark paper identifying specific internal features in Claude 3 Sonnet, representations of discrete concepts that activate in predictable ways. This is foundational work in a field that most AI labs treat as secondary. Understanding why a model behaves as it does, not just whether it does, is the difference between a safety claim and a safety practice. Together, these form an approach where the training methodology, the alignment technique, and interpretability research are all pointed at the same problem: building a model that is measurably, verifiably better, not just one that says it is. Anthropic's brand was always partly constructed against OpenAI, not in explicit terms, but structurally. The founding story implies a critique. The emphasis on safety as a core value implies that somewhere safety is not a core value. You didn't have to name the competitor. Everyone in the industry knew. This is oppositional brand architecture. Powerful because it forces the competitor into a defined role. OpenAI becomes, by implication, the one that shows scale over safety, commercial pressure over careful judgment. The problem? It only works as long as the distinction holds. OpenAI spent the years after Anthropic's founding aggressively adopting the language of safety: super alignment teams, safety frameworks, responsible deployment commitments. Sam Altman testified before Congress using vocabulary that Anthropic had spent years carefully developing. The word safety stopped doing the differentiation work. Both companies were saying it, and when both companies are saying the same thing, the claim stops being a differentiator and becomes ambient noise. Which is why the Pentagon moment carries so much brand weight. The walkout, losing a $200 million government contract by refusing to remove the red lines, is the kind of evidence that no safety press release can purchase. It's the difference between a stated value and a demonstrated one. Anthropic needed a moment where holding the line cost something real. The Pentagon gave them one. The return to negotiations is the harder question. If Anthropic re-enters on terms that dissolve the original red lines, the story shifts. A company that performed conviction when it was cheap and set it aside when the invoice arrived. If the red lines hold, it becomes something rarer, proof that the architecture is real and that the brand was never just language. Here is what the build-to-brand lens gives us on Anthropic. This is a company constructed with unusual intentionality. The founding argument was specific. The training methodology was built to prove it. The product was engineered to embody the argument. And the benchmark scores, for what they're worth, suggests it's working. Claude leads the field on scientific reasoning, real-world coding, and instruction following. The 200,000 token context window is an architectural advantage, not a marketing claim. The constitutional AI and interpretability work is published, peer-reviewed, and being adopted, imitated across the industry. The brand has always said, we are building differently, and that difference produces something better. The Pentagon negotiations are asking a harder version of the same question. Not whether safety and capability are in conflict. Claude's benchmarks have largely settled that. But whether safety and survival are. Can you stay at the frontier, hold your red lines, and remain commercially viable when the most powerful customer in the world tells you to choose? The answer Anthropic gives in that negotiation room will say more about what the company actually is than any benchmark, any research paper, or any press release ever could. That's Built to Brand. Every episode, we take one company, one moment, one decision, and look at the architecture underneath. Not what happened, but why it was built to happen that way. If this episode gave you a new angle on Anthropic, on Claude, or on how tech companies construct identity under real pressure, share it with someone who'd get something out of it. Built to Brand. See you next episode.